May 18, 1952, 11:47 a.m. The steps of Public School 90 on Lenox Avenue between 135th and 136th Streets in Harlem, one of the neighborhood's largest elementary schools, serving approximately 800 black children whose families lived within a 10-block radius and who attended classes in a building constructed in 1906 that was now overcrowded and poorly maintained because the New York City Board of Education consistently allocated fewer resources to schools serving black communities than to schools serving white communities in other neighborhoods. It was Sunday, and the school building was being used for a community event organized by the Abbas Baptist Church to celebrate Mother S Day and to honor Harlem mothers who had contributed to their families and to the broader community through volunteer work, charitable donations, or other forms of service that deserved public recognition. Approximately 300 people crowded onto the school steps on the sidewalk in front of the building. Black residents dressed in their finest Sunday clothes, women wearing hats with flowers and feathers, men in pressed suits, despite the warm spring weather, children squirming with impatience while speeches and presentations proceeded inside the building where the actual ceremony was taking place. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson stood near the bottom of the steps, holding the hand of his 10-year-old daughter Elise, who wore a yellow dress that her stepmother Mime had purchased specifically for this occasion, and who clutched a small bouquet of flowers that she had been instructed to present to her grandmother when the ceremony concluded and when family members would gather for photographs and conversation before dispersing to Sunday dinners at various homes throughout Harlem. Bumpy was 46 years old, recently married to Mame, after years of operating as Harlem's most powerful independent crime boss, someone who had negotiated peace with the Italian Mafia after Dutch Schultz's death, and who controlled the neighborhood S numbers. Rackets through a combination of strategic intelligence, community, respect, and the kind of disciplined violence that eliminated threats without creating unnecessary attention from law enforcement or from rivals who might exploit chaos. He wore a dark blue suit that had cost $450, a silk tie in a subtle paisley pattern, and shoes that gleamed with fresh polish, his appearance communicating success and respectability despite everyone present understanding that his wealth came from illegal gambling operations that generated hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. Elias looked up at her father with an expression of contentment and security, comfortable in the knowledge that Bumpy's presence meant safety and stability, even though she had been taught from early childhood never to discuss his business activities with anyone outside the immediate family, and never to answer questions from strangers about where money came from or what her father did for work. She understood, in the way children understand things without needing explicit explanations, that her father was important and powerful, and that people in Harlem treated him with a mixture of respect and fear that made her feel protected, but also occasionally isolated from other children whose fathers worked ordinary jobs and who did not have to maintain such careful boundaries between family life and public behavior. The ceremony inside was concluding, and people were beginning to emerge from the school building, mothers being photographed with their families' children running on the steps, despite parental instructions to behave properly and maintain dignity appropriate to a church event. A police car pulled up to the curb approximately 20 feet from where Bumpy and Elias stood, parking in a no-parking zone with the casual disregard for traffic regulations that New York City police officers routinely displayed because they knew they would never be ticketed or towed or held accountable for violations that would result in fines for ordinary citizens. Two white police officers emerged from the vehicle, both of them from the 28th Precinct, which covered this section of Harlem, and which was notorious for corruption and brutality, and for officers who treated black residents as subjects to be controlled rather than as citizens deserving protection and service. The driver was Sergeant Daniel "Danny" Reardon, 41 years old, 20 years with the NYPD, a third-generation Irish cop whose father and grandfather had also worked for the department and who had learned from both predecessors that policing in black neighborhoods was primarily about extracting money through protection rackets and payoff schemes rather than about actual law enforcement or public safety. Reardon was tall and thick through the chest and shoulders, his physical presence intimidating even without the gun and badge that gave him legal authority to arrest and use force against anyone who refused to comply with his demands. Reardon and his partner, Officer Thomas McCarthy, walked directly toward Bumpy Johnson, moving with the kind of deliberate purpose that communicated they had a specific target and a specific objective, rather than conducting general patrol or responding to an emergency call. People on the steps noticed the approaching officers and conversations stopped mid, the crowd falling into an uncomfortable silence as everyone calculated what was about to happen and whether they should remain as witnesses or whether they should distance themselves from whatever confrontation was developing between the most powerful black criminal in Harlem and two white cops who represented a police department that had been extracting protection payments from Harlem businesses and criminals for decades. Bumpy noticed Reardon approaching, and his expression shifted from relaxed enjoyment of a community event to something harder and more alert, his mind immediately processing threats and options and appropriate responses to whatever was about to unfold. Reardon stopped approximately 5 feet from Bumpy, positioning himself so that his body blocked Bumpy's path to the street, establishing dominance through spatial control and the way police officers are trained to use physical positioning to communicate authority and to limit options for subjects they reconfronting. Bumpy Johnson, we need to have a conversation. Step over here away from all these people. Reardon's voice was loud enough to be heard by the crowd, deliberately public, rather than discreet, announcing to everyone present that he was exercising police authority over Harlem's crime boss, regardless of setting or circumstances or social considerations that might normally suggest a different approach. Bumpy glanced down at Elisis, whose hand had tightened around his fingers, and whose face showed confusion and the beginning of fear as she sensed tension in her father's posture and recognized that something wrong was happening, even though she could unfully understand what or why. Bumpy spoke quietly, his tone controlled and respectful in the way black men in 1952 had learned to speak to white police officers if they wanted to avoid escalation or violence or arrest on fabricated charges. Said Reardon, I'm here with my daughter for a church event celebrating Mother's Day. Whatever business you think we need to discuss can wait until tomorrow, when I'll be happy to meet you at any location you specify. This is not an appropriate time or place for police business. The response was reasonable and deferential, offering cooperation, while requesting basic consideration for the setting and for the presence of a child, and for the fact that this was a community celebration that had nothing to do with criminal activity or law enforcement concerns. But Reardon had not come to the school steps to have a reasonable conversation, or to respect social boundaries, or to demonstrate the kind of professional judgment that would recognize the difference between appropriate and inappropriate contexts for police intervention. I decide what's appropriate, Johnson, and what I've decided is that you and I need to have a conversation right now about the arrangements we discussed 3 weeks ago regarding your weekly contributions to the Precinct Benevolent Fund. You remember that conversation, right? The one where I explained that your protection costs were going up from $200 weekly to $500 weekly because expenses have increased, and because the captain has decided that major operators like you need to contribute more to ensure that police interference with your numbers business remains minimal. Reardon's words were deliberately chosen to humiliate Bumpy in front of the crowd, to make explicit what everyone knew but rarely discussed openly, which was that Harlem's police officers were paid partners in the illegal gambling operations. They were theoretically supposed to be suppressing that protection money flowed weekly from criminals to cops through an organized system that made the police department complicit in and dependent on the same activities they arrested people for when payoffs were made, or when someone needed to be punished for stepping out of line. Bumpy's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. I told you 3 weeks ago that I was not paying $500 weekly. The arrangement has been $200 for 5 years, and that arrangement works fine for everyone. If costs have increased, that's a problem for the 28th Precinct to solve internally, not a problem for me to subsidize through increased payments. My answer 3 weeks ago was no. My answer today is still no. Now please step aside so my daughter and I can rejoin the ceremony. The refusal was clear and firm, but still delivered without aggression or disrespect, walking the impossible line that black men had to navigate when dealing with white authority figures who demanded submission but who interpreted any submission as weakness, justifying further exploitation while simultaneously interpreting any resistance as insubordination, justifying immediate violent response. Reardon smiled, but it was not a friendly smile or an amused smile, but rather the kind of cold expression that people make when they about to demonstrate power and inflict consequences on someone who has refused to acknowledge their authority. See, that's where you're wrong. Johnson, your refusal to pay is my problem because it makes me look weak in front of my captain and in front of other cops who depend on those protection payments to supplement the shit salaries the city pays us. And when I look weak, I need to demonstrate strength by reminding people what happens when someone refuses to cooperate with reasonable police requests for financial support. Reardon turned to his partner McCarthy. Tommy, I think Mr. Johnson here is carrying a concealed weapon in violation of New York state law. I think we need to search him and then arrest him for unlawful possession and for resisting officer instructions during a lawful investigation. Don't you think that's what we need to do? McCarthy nodded, reaching for the handcuffs on his belt. The motion mechanical and practiced because both officers had done this hundreds of times before, arresting people on fabricated charges to extort money or to punish refusal to pay or simply to demonstrate that police authority in Harlem was absolute and unquestionable, regardless of truth or legality or basic human decency. Bumpy released Elias's hand and raised both arms slightly away from his body, a gesture indicating compliance and non-resistance, understanding that any physical opposition would give Reardon justification to beat him or shoot him and claim self-defense. Afterward, Officer McCarthy, you can search me if that's what Sergeant Reardon has ordered you to do. You won't find a weapon because I'm not carrying one. I came to a church event with my daughter. I don't bring guns to Sunday morning celebrations attended by mothers and children. But if you need to search me to satisfy your sergeant's instructions, go ahead and do what you've been told to do. McCarthy moved behind Bumpy and conducted a pat-down search that was unnecessarily rough and invasive hands, checking pockets and waistband and ankles with more force than required for determining whether someone was armed. The physical aggression designed to humiliate and to communicate dominance rather than to conduct legitimate investigation. The search revealed nothing because Bumpy was in fact not carrying a weapon. McCarthy stepped back and shook his head at Reardon. No gun, Sarge. Reardon's expression didn't change. Check again. I'm sure I saw a bulge under his jacket that looked like a weapon. Maybe you missed it because you weren't thorough enough the first time. McCarthy hesitated, recognizing that Reardon was instructing him to lie about finding a gun that didn't exist to manufacture evidence that would justify an arrest that had no legitimate legal basis. Before McCarthy could respond, Bumpy spoke in a voice that was still quiet, but that carried an edge of steel underneath the surface calm. Sergeant Reardon, you're going to arrest me right now in front of 300 witnesses, including dozens of respectable church members and community leaders who are watching this entire interaction. You're going to do this in front of my 10-year-old daughter who is standing 3 feet away, trying to understand why police officers are treating her father this way during a Mother's Day celebration. You're going to fabricate charges about a weapon that doesn't exist because I refused to pay you an additional $300 per week in protection money. You understand that's what you're doing right now? You understand that everyone here sees exactly what this is. The questions were not asked in a challenging tone or an aggressive tone, but rather in a tone of genuine inquiry, as if Bumpy was simply trying to confirm that Reardon fully understood the implications of his actions and the permanent damage he was about to inflict on relationships between police and community and on one child's understanding of justice and authority. Reardon stepped closer to Bumpy. Close enough that only Bumpy and Elias could hear his next words clearly. I understand perfectly. Johnson, I understand that you think you run Harlem and that white cops have to respect your authority and your position. I understand that you think you can refuse to pay what you're told to pay, and that there will and be consequences. So let me teach you something, and let me teach your daughter something too. In this city, in this neighborhood, white men with badges decide what happens, not black gangsters. No matter how much money they make or how much respect they get from other black people, white cops decide, white judges decide, white politicians decide, and black criminals do what they're told, or they go to jail, or they get hurt, or they die. That's how this works. That's what your daughter needs to learn today, so she doesn't grow up thinking her daddy is some kind of king who doesn't have to answer to proper authority. Now turn around and put your hands behind your back so Officer McCarthy can cuff you. Bumpy turned slowly to face Elias before complying with Reardon's instruction. kneeling down to her eye level, ignoring the officers behind him who were preparing to arrest him, focusing entirely on his daughter, who was now crying silently, with tears running down her face, and her small body trembling as she tried to understand what was happening and why her father was being treated this way by men who were supposed to protect people and keep them safe. Bumpy spoke in a voice so gentle it seemed impossible that it could come from someone who had killed 40 men during his criminal career and who had built an empire through violence and intimidation and strategic ruthlessness. "Elizis, baby, listen to me. These officers are going to take me away for a little while. It's going to be okay. Nothing bad is going to happen. Your mama Mime is right over there by the school door watching everything. As soon as these men put me in their car, you go straight to Mame, and she'll take you home. I'll be home tomorrow. This is just something that happens sometimes when people don't agree about business things. It doesn't mean anything bad. You understand? I need you to be brave and strong right now and not be scared." But Alice was not brave and not strong in that moment, because she was 10 years old, and she was watching her father being arrested on the steps of her school in front of 300 people from her community, and nothing her father could say would make that experience less traumatic or less terrifying or less permanently damaging to her. Understanding of safety and authority and whether the world was a place where good people were protected, or a place where power belonged to whoever had guns and badges and the willingness to use them against people who could unfight back. Bumpy stood slowly and turned around, placing his hands behind his back while McCarthy applied handcuffs. The metal clicking closed around his wrists with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silence that had descended over the crowd. Reardon grabbed Bumpy's arm and pulled him roughly toward the police car, the motion unnecessarily violent, designed to demonstrate dominance and to humiliate someone who had refused to accept subordinate status. "Teach your father a lesson, little girl," Reardon called back over his shoulder as they walked toward the car, addressing Elise directly with words intended to maximize trauma and shame. "Tell him next time cops tell him to do something, he does it immediately without questions or excuses. Maybe then he won't have to get arrested in front of you at church events. Maybe then you won't have to watch him get put in handcuffs like a common criminal. Remember this day, sweetheart. Remember what happens when black people forget their place." The car door slammed and the vehicle pulled away from the curb, leaving Elise standing alone on the school steps with her yellow dress and her flowers and her tears, surrounded by 300 witnesses who had just watched Harlem's most powerful crime boss get arrested on fabricated charges by a corrupt white cop who was teaching a lesson about race and power and who exactly controlled life and death and freedom in black neighborhoods in 1952. May 19, 1952, 9:30 a.m., 16 hours after Bumpy's arrest on the school steps. The offices of the New York Amsterdam News at 2348th Avenue, Harlem's most influential black newspaper, with a weekly circulation of approximately 100,000 copies reaching readers throughout New York City and in other major urban centers where black migrants from the South had established communities during the Great Migration. The newspaper's editor, James Hicks, sat at his desk reviewing Leasorth, the upcoming weekend edition, when his secretary informed him that 3 men were requesting an immediate meeting without an appointment, one of whom was Bumpy Johnson, who had been released from custody at the 28th Precinct. Early that morning, after spending less than 24 hours in a holding cell because the district attorney's office had declined to prosecute charges of weapons possession and resisting arrest, after reviewing the arrest report and finding zero evidence to support either accusation, and after receiving phone calls from 2 prominent Harlem ministers who had been present at the Mother Este event, and who were prepared to testify that the entire arrest had been witnessed by 300 people who could confirm that Bumpy had complied with all police instructions, had not been carrying any weapon. Hicks instructed his secretary to show the visitors in immediately, because James Hicks understood that when Bumpy Johnson requested an urgent meeting at a newspaper office, something significant was about to be revealed that would make news and potentially change conditions in Harlem in ways that mattered to the black community that the Amsterdam News served. Bumpy entered the office, followed by 2 associates whose names Hicks did unknow, but who he recognized as men who worked in Bumpy's organization, managing various aspects of the numbers, operations, and other criminal enterprises that generated Bumpy's wealth and influence. That when Bumpy Johnson requested an urgent meeting at a newspaper office, something significant was about to be revealed that would make news and potentially change conditions in Harlem in ways that mattered to the black community that the Amsterdam News served. Bumpy entered the office, followed by two associates whose names Hicks didn't know, but who he recognized as men who worked in Bumpy's organization, managing various aspects of the numbers, operations, and other criminal enterprises that generated Bumpy's wealth and influence. But what immediately captured Hicks's attention was not the presence of Bumpy or his associates, but rather the leather briefcase that Bumpy carried, a worn brown case that looked heavy and bulging with contents that suggested this meeting was about documentation rather than conversation, about evidence rather than allegations, about material that could be published and verified rather than rumors or unsubstantiated claims. Bumpy sat down across from Hicks and placed the briefcase on the desk between them, his expression neutral, but his eyes showing an intensity that Hicks had rarely seen in their previous interactions over the years when Bumpy had occasionally provided information to the newspaper about police corruption or community issues that deserved public attention. "Mr. Hicks, thank you for seeing me without notice. What I'm about to give you is documentation of systematic police corruption in the 28th Precinct spanning the past 8 years. This briefcase contains ledgers showing weekly payoff amounts paid by 73 different Harlem businesses and criminal operations to specific police officers and to the precinct captain. It contains photographs of police officers collecting envelopes at designated locations. It contains signed statements from 6 business owners and 11 numbers runners describing their experiences being extorted by cops who threatened arrest or violence if payments were made on schedule. It contains copies of arrest reports for fabricated charges used to punish people who refused to pay or who complained about police harassment. And it contains detailed records of my own payments to the 28th Precinct totaling approximately $96,000 over 8 years, including receipts and bank records showing exactly when and how money was transferred from my organization to police officers who were supposedly investigating illegal gambling but who were actually partners in that gambling, receiving regular compensation for allowing operations to continue without interference. Hicks stared at the briefcase, his mind processing the implications of what Bumpy had just described. Documentation of police corruption was nothing new in Harlem, where everyone understood that cops were paid partners in illegal activities rather than actual law enforcement. But documented evidence that could be published and used in criminal investigations was extremely rare because people who kept records of bribes and payoffs typically destroyed those records immediately after transactions were completed, understanding that maintaining documentation created risks of exposure if materials were seized during raids or subpoenaed during investigations or stolen by rivals or employees. The fact that Bumpy had maintained 8 years of detailed financial records documenting his own illegal activities and his payments to corrupt police officers suggested that he had been preparing for exactly this moment, had been collecting evidence systematically with the intention of using it as a weapon when circumstances required exposing the entire corrupt system rather than continuing to operate within that system. "Why now?" Hicks asked, the question encompassing everything that needed to be understood about motivation and timing and risk. "You've been paying police protection for years. Everyone in Harlem knows that's how the system works. You've accepted it, worked within it, profited from it despite the costs. Why are you suddenly willing to expose this corruption when doing so will definitely cause massive problems for your own operations? The police will retaliate. The Italian Mafia will be concerned about you drawing federal attention to illegal gambling. Other criminals will see you as someone who gave evidence to authorities and to newspapers, which violates every rule of criminal culture about never cooperating with police or prosecutors or anyone who might use information against other criminals. So why are you doing this right now when you know it will cost you enormously in multiple ways?" Bumpy's expression hardened, and his voice carried an anger that he rarely displayed openly, because displaying emotion was weakness in the world he inhabited, weakness that rivals could exploit. Because yesterday morning, Sergeant Daniel Reardon arrested me on fabricated weapons charges in front of 300 witnesses at a church Mother's Day celebration because I refused to increase my weekly protection payments from $200 to $500. He arrested me in front of my 10-year-old daughter, who was standing next to me holding my hand when 2 white cops put handcuffs on me and dragged me away from a Sunday morning community event while telling my child that she needed to teach her father a lesson about respecting police authority and accepting his proper place as a black man in a city controlled by white people with badges. My daughter watched her father get arrested on false charges by a corrupt cop who was angry that I would unpay him $300 extra per week. She stood on those school steps crying and terrified while that motherfucker put me in a police car and drove away like he had done something righteous instead of something evil. That's why I'm here with 8 years of documentation. That's why I'm willing to expose the entire corrupt system. That SYI do UNT care anymore about the rules or the retaliation or what happens to my business operations. Because no amount of money or criminal profit is worth allowing my daughter to grow up believing that police officers can humiliate her father in public with impunity. That white cops can terrorize black families without consequences. That corruption and racism and abuse of power are just normal parts of life that have to be accepted and tolerated and ignored. The room fell silent as Hicks absorbed what Bumpy had said, understanding that this was not a rational business decision or a strategic calculation about optimal timing for exposing corruption, but rather a deeply personal response to a violation that had crossed a line that Bumpy had uneven known existed until yesterday morning when he watched his daughter's face while being arrested on charges that everyone present knew were false. Hicks opened the briefcase and began examining the materials. Bumpy had provided flipping through ledgers and photographs and statements. His journalist instinct immediately recognizing that these documents were authentic and detailed and devastating, that publishing them would trigger investigations and arrests and reforms and possibly federal intervention in the NYPD's operations in Harlem, because the evidence was too comprehensive and too specific to be dismissed as rumor or allegation or the complaints of criminals who could be trusted to tell truth about police activities. I'll need to verify some of this material before we publish, Hicks said carefully, understanding that the Amsterdam News had to maintain journalistic standards even when receiving explosive evidence from sources who had their own motivations for exposure. I'll need to confirm that these ledgers are authentic, that the photographs show what you claim they show, that the statements from business owners and runners are genuine, and that these people are willing to go on record, or at least willing to have their information used in our reporting even if they remain anonymous in the published articles. This verification process will take several days minimum, possibly a week. Are you prepared to wait that long, or do you need this material published immediately for some reason related to your own situation? The question was professional and appropriate, but also tested whether Bumpy was acting impulsively out of anger or whether he had thought through the implications and timeline for what he was initiating. Take whatever time you need to verify everything, Bumpy responded. I've been collecting this documentation for 8 years, precisely so that when I decided to use it, no one could dismiss it as fabricated or unreliable. Every ledger entry can be corroborated with bank records. Every photograph can be matched to dates and locations that business owners will confirm. Every statement can be verified through interviews with the people who provided them. I'm not giving you rumors or hearsay. I'm giving you evidence that will stand up in court if federal prosecutors decide to investigate. And I'm also giving you something else. Bumpy reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a sealed envelope which he placed on Hicks's desk next to the briefcase. This envelope contains a letter addressed to Congressman Adam Clayton Powell Jr. detailing everything in that briefcase, and requesting that he use his position to demand a federal investigation into police corruption in the 28th Precinct. I'm giving you this letter so you can publish it alongside your articles, so readers can see that this information is also going directly to the most powerful black politician in New York City, who has the authority to trigger investigations that go beyond city-level enforcement. Hicks opened the envelope and read the letter quickly, recognizing that Bumpy had written it himself, rather than having an attorney draft it. The language straightforward and factual rather than emotional or accusatory, presenting evidence and requesting action without making inflammatory claims that might be dismissed as exaggeration or criminal. The letter was smart and strategic, leveraging Powell's position as both a Baptist minister with moral authority and a Democratic congressman with political power, creating pressure for investigation from multiple directions simultaneously through media exposure and political demands. Hicks looked up from the letter and met Bumpy's eyes. You understand that publishing this will make you a target for every corrupt cop in Harlem, that they'll look for ways to arrest you or frame you or possibly just kill you for exposing their protection rackets, that other criminals might see you as a snitch who broke the code about never cooperating with authorities or media, that your business operations will suffer because the police will no longer provide protection and will probably actively interfere with your numbers, banks, and runners. Bumpy stood up, preparing to leave, his expression showing not triumph or satisfaction, but rather something closer to exhaustion or resignation, or acceptance of consequences that he had calculated and found acceptable compared to allowing yesterday's humiliation to stand unchallenged. I understand all of that, Mr. Hicks. I understand the risks and the costs, but I also understand something that I think corrupt cops and other criminals don't understand, which is that some violations can't be tolerated, even when tolerating them would be smarter or safer or more profitable. What Sergeant Reardon did yesterday on those school steps in front of my daughter crossed a line that can't be on. He didn't just arrest me on false charges. He terrorized a 10-year-old child to teach her father a lesson about racial hierarchy and police power. Used a moteres de celebration to demonstrate that black people in Harlem live at the mercy of white cops who can destroy families and humiliate parents and traumatize children whenever they choose to exercise their authority. That's not something I can let stand. That's not something any father should let stand. So publish the evidence and give the letter to Powell and let federal investigators decide what happens next. And if corrupt cops come after me, or if other criminals call me a snitch, I'll deal with those consequences when they arrive. But at least my daughter will know that her father did undecept what happened yesterday. Did undisplay the increased protection money and pretend nothing had occurred, didn't teach her that injustice has to be tolerated when fighting. It is dangerous or expensive. The Amsterdam News published the first article in what became a 7-part series on police corruption in the 28th Precinct on Saturday, May 24, 1952, 6 days after Bumpy's meeting with James Hicks. The article included photographs of police officers collecting protection payments, excerpts from ledgers showing systematic weekly payoffs, and statements from business owners who had agreed to go on record describing their experiences being extorted by cops who threatened arrest or violence if payments were made. The article also published Bumpy's letter to Congressman Powell in full, including the specific allegation that Sergeant Daniel Reardon had arrested Bumpy on fabricated weapons charges during a Mother's Day church event in front of 300 witnesses, including Bumpy's 10-year-old daughter, using the arrest to punish Bumpy for refusing to increase protection payments from $200 weekly to $500 weekly. The article identified Reardon by name and badge number, included his photograph, and provided detailed description of the arrest, including statements from 5 witnesses who had been present on the school steps and who confirmed that Bumpy had not been carrying a weapon and had not resisted arrest or behaved in any way that would justify the charges filed against him. The publication triggered immediate reactions from multiple directions. Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, Jr. issued a statement the same day calling for federal investigation of police corruption in Harlem's 28th Precinct, and demanding that the U.S. Attorney's Office review evidence of systematic civil rights violations by New York City police officers who were using arrest powers to extort money from black businesses and residents. The New York City Police Commissioner, George Paseo Monaghan, initially defended the 28th Precinct and dismissed the Amsterdam News articles as unsubstantiated allegations from criminals who were attempting to deflect attention from their own illegal activities. But when subsequent articles published additional documentation, including bank records and additional witness statements and photographs showing specific officers collecting money at specific locations on specific dates, Monaghan was forced to announce an internal affairs investigation into corruption allegations involving at least 12 officers stationed at the 28th Precinct, including Sergeant Daniel Reardon, who was immediately placed on administrative leave pending the investigation's findings. Maintain the consistency of the characters. This is a story about black bosses in the early 1950s, specifically Bumpy Johnson. By July 1952, 2 months after the first Amsterdam News article appeared, federal prosecutors from the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York had opened a criminal investigation into civil rights violations by NYPD officers who were using their badges and arrests powers to extort money from Harlem residents and businesses. The investigation eventually resulted in criminal charges against 13 police officers, including Sergeant Daniel Reardon, who was indicted on charges of extortion, civil rights violations, filing false police reports, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. 8 of the 13 indicted officers eventually pleaded guilty and received sentences ranging from 18 months to 5 years in federal prison. Reardon went to trial, was convicted on all charges in December 1952, and was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. The judge specifically noting during sentencing that Reardon's arrest of Bumpy Johnson in front of Johnson's daughter at a church event represented particularly egregious abuse of police authority that deserved enhanced punishment beyond what other convicted officers received. The investigation and the resulting prosecutions changed policing in Harlem, though not as dramatically or permanently as reformers hoped. The 28th Precinct underwent management reorganization, with new captain and new policies requiring documentation of all arrests and requiring supervisory approval for certain types of enforcement actions in cases where corruption allegations had been common. Protection payments from criminals to police did undo completely, but they decreased significantly for several years as officers became more cautious about exposure, and as federal prosecutors maintained ongoing monitoring of the precinct's activities. Some business owners reported reduced harassment and fewer demands for payoffs from cops who had previously treated extortion as a routine part of their duties. The changes were temporary and incomplete, as corrupt practices gradually resumed over subsequent years, when attention shifted elsewhere and when new officers arrived who had experienced the consequences of the 1952 investigation. But for approximately 3 years between 1952 and 1955, policing in Harlem operated under somewhat different rules as a result of Bumpy Johnson's decision to expose systematic corruption rather than continuing to pay increased protection costs. For Bumpy, personally, the consequences were exactly what he had anticipated and accepted as necessary costs of exposing corruption. Several corrupt officers who avoided federal prosecution but who lost protection income blamed Bumpy for destroying their supplemental earnings and looked for opportunities to arrest him on any available charges. Other Harlem criminals expressed concerns about doing business with someone who had provided evidence to newspapers and federal prosecutors, worried that cooperation with authorities in one context might establish precedent for cooperation. In other contexts, if Bumpy faced pressure or needed leverage in future situations, the Italian Mafia expressed displeasure that federal attention had been drawn to Harlem's gambling operations, though they ultimately accepted Bumpy's explanation that he had specifically avoided exposing Mafia involvement or providing information about the tribute payments he made to Italian crime families. Bumpy's numbers operations continued functioning, but with increased interference from police, who were no longer receiving protection payments, and who therefore had less incentive to ignore illegal gambling activity when opportunities arose to make arrests or seize money or disrupt operations. But what mattered most to Bumpy was not the business consequences or the increased law enforcement attention or the damaged relationships with other criminals, but rather what happened when he returned home after his meeting with James Hicks and explained to Lisa's why he had been arrested and what he had decided to do in response to that arrest. He sat with his daughter in their apartment on Lenox Avenue and told her that what Sergeant Reardon had done on the school steps was wrong, was illegal, was an abuse of power that should never have happened and that should be allowed to continue happening to other black families in Harlem. He told her that he had kept records for 8 years documenting police corruption specifically, so that when someone crossed a line and did something unacceptable, he would have weapons to fight back with besides guns and violence and criminal retaliation. He told her that sometimes the right response to injustice was not accepting it quietly or paying money to make it go away, but rather exposing it publicly and demanding that people in power face consequences for their actions, even when seeking those consequences, created risks and costs for the person demanding accountability. Alice listened to her father's explanation with an expression that was serious and thoughtful beyond her 10 years, processing information about corruption and power and choices that most children never had to consider, but that black children in 1952, Harlem often learned earlier than white children, learned because surviving in segregated America required understanding systems and hierarchies and dangers that white families could ignore. When Bumpy finished explaining what he had done and why, Elise asked one question that revealed she understood exactly what her father's decision meant. "Are they going to hurt you, Daddy? The police officers who got in trouble, are they going to hurt you for telling people what they did?" Bumpy couldn't lie to his daughter and tell her that no danger existed when danger very clearly existed, and when lying would have been patronizing and insulting to a child who deserved honest answers about the world she lived in. So he told her the truth. Maybe. some of them might try. But I'll be careful, and I'll be protected, and I'll make sure nothing happens to me or to you or to Mama Mame. And even if something does happen, you'll know that your father fought back when someone did something wrong instead of accepting it, because fighting back was dangerous. That's important. That's what I want you to remember about this whole situation. Years later, after Bumpy's death, in 1968, after Elise had grown into adulthood and experienced her own struggles and her own challenges navigating life as the daughter of Harlem's most famous crime boss, she would occasionally tell the story of May 18, 1952. Two people who asked what her father was really like, beyond the legend and the mythology and the criminal reputation that dominated public understanding of L's Bumpy Johnson. She would describe standing on the school steps, watching her father get arrested, while Sergeant Reardon told her to teach her father a lesson about respecting police authority. She would describe the terror and confusion of that moment, the permanent damage to her sense of safety and trust in authority, figures who wore badges and claimed to protect people, while actually terrorizing them. But she would also describe what happened the next day and the days that followed, when her father transformed personal humiliation into systemic exposure, when he used 8 years of documented evidence to trigger investigations that sent 13 corrupt cops to prison and temporarily reformed policing in Harlem, and demonstrated that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice was not violence or retaliation, but rather strategic use of truth and evidence and institutional mechanisms that existed to hold powerful people accountable when those people violated the law while enforcing the law. The story of what happened after Sergeant Reardon arrested Bumpy Johnson on the steps of public school 90 on May 18, 1952, became part of Harlem's collective memory, discussed in barbershops and churches and family conversations as an example of how one person's decision to fight back against corruption could change systems that seemed permanent and unchangeable. The story was complicated and morally ambiguous because the person who exposed police corruption was himself a criminal who had paid those same corrupt cops for years and who profited from illegal gambling that exploited poor people's dreams of sudden wealth through lucky numbers. But the story was also inspiring and instructive because it demonstrated that even people operating outside the law could sometimes serve justice by exposing violations that law enforcement itself was unwilling to acknowledge or investigate. That sometimes criminals had standing to demand accountability from corrupt officials because criminals were the ones who experienced that corruption most directly and who had evidence of that corruption that no one else possessed. The next day, after Reardon's arrest of Bumpy Johnson on the school steps, did just change Bumpy's life, or Reardon's life, or Elise's life. It changed Harlem forever by establishing precedent that police corruption could be exposed and prosecuted, that black communities had weapons, besides violence, to fight back against systematic exploitation by officers who used badges as licenses for extortion, that newspapers like the Amsterdam News would publish evidence of official wrongdoing even when that evidence came from criminals whose own activities were illegal, and that powerful black politicians like Adam Clayton Powell, Jr. would demand federal intervention when local authorities refused to address abuses that destroyed trust between police and communities. The changes were temporary and incomplete, but they were real. And they mattered, and they demonstrated that systems could be challenged and sometimes changed when people decided that certain violations couldn't be tolerated regardless of personal costs of demanding accountability.